The first thing people noticed about Kael'thir was not his strength, because there were many warriors in the northern kingdoms who could lift heavier swords, break thicker shields, or ride faster horses across frozen plains. The first thing people noticed was that he walked into a battlefield as if he had already accepted every possible ending. He did not carry enchanted armor, did not summon storms from his hands, did not whisper ancient words to awaken hidden power beneath the earth. In an age where kings paid fortunes for sorcerers and armies marched behind warriors blessed by forgotten spirits, Kael carried only a worn steel blade, a weather-stained cloak, and the quiet certainty that a person's worth was measured by what they chose to do when no miracle came to save them. The village of Arden Hollow had forgotten the sound of peaceful mornings. For 3 years, the valley had lived under the shadow of the Ashen Dominion, an empire whose armies moved like a spreading fire across the continent. Their soldiers wore black iron masks and followed commanders who believed fear was a stronger weapon than any sword. Every harvest season, they arrived at the village gates demanding grain, livestock, and young recruits for wars fought hundreds of miles away. Those who refused disappeared. Those who resisted became examples carved into the memories of everyone left behind. On the morning Kael arrived, the people of Arden Hollow were not preparing for a festival or a celebration. They were digging a grave. The village elder, Mari Ellison, stood beside the wooden platform where the body of her son had been placed beneath a simple cloth. He had been 19 years old, and the Ashen soldiers had taken him 2 weeks earlier after he struck an officer who insulted his younger sister. No one knew where he died. No one knew how long he suffered. The Empire never returned bodies unless it wanted to send a message. Kael stood at the edge of the crowd, watching villagers lower their heads as the elder spoke. "We have buried too many names," Mara said, her voice rough from exhaustion rather than tears. "We have counted too many empty chairs at dinner tables. We have waited for heroes who never came." Several people glanced toward Kael when she said that, because rumors had traveled ahead of him. They said he had once fought beside royal armies. They said he had defeated creatures that killed entire patrols. They said he had survived a battle where every other warrior died. But rumors had a way of becoming larger than the truth. The truth was that Kael had left the battlefield years ago. The truth was that he carried scars across his ribs and a memory of every person he failed to protect. The truth was that he no longer believed one warrior could change the course of a war. After the funeral, a young woman named Ilara approached him near the village well. Unlike most people, she did not look at him with hope. She looked at him with suspicion. She was a healer, a former apprentice of the royal physicians, and one of the few people in Arden Hollow who still spoke directly to soldiers instead of lowering her eyes. "You're leaving," she said. Kael looked toward the road leading out of the valley. "That was the plan." "You always say that," she asked. "When people ask you for help." Kael tightened the strap on his travel pack. "People ask for things warriors cannot give." Ilara studied him carefully. "And what can warriors give?" "A few more minutes before they lose." Her expression hardened. "That's a strange thing to say for someone who looks like he has spent his entire life trying to win." Kael did not answer. Instead, he looked toward the mountains where dark smoke rose in the distance. The Ashen Dominion had a fortress hidden beyond those peaks, a place called Blackstone Keep. No ordinary army had ever captured it. The Empire's generals claimed the fortress was protected by ancient magic, a barrier created by forgotten mages centuries ago. Every attack against it ended the same way. Soldiers marched forward, the sky turned red, and survivors returned carrying stories of impossible weapons and invisible enemies. Kael had heard those stories before. He had also learned that people often called something magic when they were too afraid to understand it. Before he could leave the village, a messenger arrived riding a horse covered in blood. The animal collapsed at the village entrance, and the rider barely managed to climb down before falling to the ground. His name was Taran Voss, a former intelligence officer from the Northern Alliance. He carried a sealed letter marked with the symbol of the Old Kingdom, a symbol Kael had not seen since the war that destroyed his home. When Kael opened the letter, he found a single sentence written in the handwriting of General Rovan, his former commander and the man who had taught him everything about war. "Kael, if you receive this, do not trust the legends of Blackstone Keep. The enemy is not protecting a secret.
They are hiding one. Find the prisoner beneath the fortress before the eclipse. The letter ended there. No explanation. No warning. Just a command from a dead man. Cale knew Rovan was dead.
He had watched him fall during the Battle of Silver Pass 6 years earlier. He had carried the general's sword back to the surviving soldiers himself.
Yet the handwriting was unmistakable. Ilara noticed the change in his expression.
"Who sent that?" she asked.
Cale folded the letter. Someone who should not be able to send anything. That is not an answer. It is the only one I have.
The village gathered around them as rumors spread.
Some wanted Cale to investigate.
Others wanted him gone before trouble followed him.
The blacksmith, a massive man named Borin Hale, stepped forward and planted his hammer into the dirt.
"If the Empire has something hidden in that fortress, we need to know what it is," he said.
"Knowing has gotten people killed," Cale replied. Borin laughed bitterly. "And ignorance has kept us alive?"
The question stayed in the air because no one had an answer.
Cale had spent years believing survival was enough.
But standing among people who had lost everything while still finding reasons to stand, he felt the uncomfortable weight of responsibility returning.
Not the glory warriors sang about. Not the pride of victory. The heavier burden of choosing whether to act when walking away would be easier.
That night, Cale left the village with Ilara, Borin, and Taran following behind him.
He did not invite them. They simply refused to stay.
Their journey toward Blackstone Keep began beneath a sky filled with approaching storm clouds, and none of them knew that the fortress they were traveling toward was not hiding a weapon, a treasure, or an ancient spell. It was hiding a person who could destroy everything the world believed about magic, power, and the meaning of being a warrior. 3 days into the journey, the group reached the abandoned city of Velmora, a place that had once been the center of scholars, inventors, and historians before the Ashen Dominion burned it nearly to the ground. The streets were silent except for the wind moving through broken buildings.
Statues of forgotten kings stood with their faces destroyed.
Libraries that once contained thousands of years of knowledge were now piles of ash and stone.
Taran led them through narrow alleys until they reached an underground entrance hidden beneath a collapsed marketplace.
"Why are we here?"
Ilara asked. Taran looked uneasy.
"Because before the Empire conquered this city, they searched every archive for one particular record."
Cale looked at the sealed door ahead. "What record?" Taran hesitated.
"The history of the first warriors."
Borin frowned. "Everyone knows that story."
"No," Taran said quietly. "Everyone knows the version the Empire allows them to know." The door opened with a grinding sound, revealing a chamber untouched by fire. Ancient symbols covered the walls, but unlike magical inscriptions, these were carved by hand. There were no glowing crystals, no mysterious energy, no signs of supernatural power.
Only the work of people. At the center of the room sat a broken stone tablet.
Cale approached it and brushed away centuries of dust. The writing beneath revealed a truth that made him stop breathing for a moment.
The first warriors of the world had not been chosen by magic.
They had not been gifted impossible abilities. They had been ordinary people who fought against those who believed power belonged only to the few. The legends had been changed. The stories had been rewritten.
Magic had not created warriors. Warriors had created the legends of magic. Before Cale could say anything, the chamber shook.
A hidden mechanism activated beneath the floor, and a voice echoed from the darkness behind them. I wondered how long it would take before someone finally found the truth. They turned toward the entrance. A figure stepped from the shadows wearing the armor of the Ashen Dominion, but the helmet was missing. The man was older than Cale expected, with silver hair and a scar running across one eye. He looked directly at Cale and smiled.
"You took your time, son of Vaer."
Cale's hand moved toward his sword.
"How do you know my name?"
The man's smile disappeared.
"Because I knew your father."
A silence fell over the chamber.
Cale had spent his entire life believing his father died before he was old enough to remember him.
The stranger removed a small metal emblem from his armor and placed it on the ground. It carried the same symbol as the Old Kingdom.
The same symbol that appeared on General Roven's letter.
Your father was not a farmer, the man said. He was the last guardian of a secret the Empire killed thousands to protect.
Cale stared at the emblem, unable to move. Who are you?
The stranger looked toward the shattered tablet behind him. Someone who spent 20 years trying to stop the world from discovering what you are about to learn. He stepped closer. The Empire does not fear magic, Cale.
They fear people who realize they never needed it.
Outside, thunder exploded across the sky, and far beyond the mountains, the gates of Blackstone keep open for the first time in 50 years. The war that everyone thought had already begun was only now revealing its true shape.
Cale did not move when the stranger finished speaking.
The storm outside continued to hammer against the ruins of Velmora, but inside the underground chamber, the sound seemed distant, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. His hand remained near the hilt of his sword, not because he expected an attack, but because every instinct he had learned as a soldier told him that a person carrying impossible truths was often more dangerous than a person carrying a weapon.
You knew my father, Cale said at last.
His voice was controlled, but the question beneath it was sharper than any blade.
Tell me his name. The stranger looked at him for several seconds before answering. Aron Vare.
The name struck harder than Cale expected. He had heard it only in fragments throughout his childhood, usually from his mother, and always followed by a warning that some memories were better left buried. His mother had never described Aron as a hero. She had never told stories of battles or victories. Whenever Cale asked about him, she would simply say, "Your father believed protecting people mattered more than being remembered." As a child, Cale thought that sounded like an excuse. As an adult, he understood it sounded like something a person said after losing too much.
My father died when I was 5, Cale said.
That is what I was told. That is what you were.
During a period of censorship.
A young mechanic who repaired transportation systems during a crisis because she believed strangers deserved help even if nobody would ever know her name.
When people asked why she spent her life studying unknown individuals, Leora always gave the same answer.
Because history has a habit of remembering the person who held the sword and forgetting the person who built the road that allowed them to reach the battle. Her work eventually brought her to a remote region beyond the old borders of the Ashen Dominion. There, buried beneath layers of earth and vegetation, she discovered the remains of a small settlement that had existed during the years immediately after the Empire's fall. The village was not mentioned in any major historical records.
No famous warriors had lived there. No battles had been fought there. At first, Leora believed the discovery would have little importance.
Then she found the journals. They belonged to a woman named Aria Vel, a healer who had lived during the first rebuilding years.
Aria had never met Cale Vare.
She had never entered a battlefield. She had never advised kings or influenced councils. But her journals revealed something remarkable.
They showed how ordinary people rebuilt their lives after the Empire collapsed.
They showed neighbors who had once fought standing together to repair homes. They showed former soldiers learning farming because they no longer wanted to carry weapons. They showed children growing up in a world where they were not defined by the conflicts of their parents. One passage especially caught Leora's attention.
Aria wrote, "The end of war is not when the fighting stops. The end of war is when people finally stop preparing to hate." Leora spent years studying Aria's journals.
Eventually, she realized that the story of Cale Vare had never truly been about the battles he fought.
It was about what happened after the battles ended. Anyone could destroy. Anyone could conquer. The difficult task was building something that could survive after the hero was gone.
Her discovery changed the way history was taught.
Schools no longer focused only on famous figures.
They began teaching networks of courage. They showed students that every major transformation was created by countless people making choices together. This became known as the shared legacy theory, though many people simply called it the truth that Cale had always understood. But even in this enlightened age, humanity faced one final challenge. It came not from an empire, not from a movement, and not from a technology seeking control.
It came from exhaustion.
After thousands of years of crises, some people began believing that humanity was trapped in an endless cycle. They looked at history and saw the same conflicts repeating in different forms. They saw wars, divisions, mistakes, and suffering. They concluded that perhaps humanity itself was the problem. A movement called the Quiet Path emerged, arguing that the only way to end conflict was for humanity to reduce ambition, reduce competition, and reduce change. Their leaders did not seek power. They sought withdrawal. They believed the world would become peaceful only when people stopped trying to shape it. Their message attracted many followers who were tired of uncertainty. They were not angry. They were simply tired. They wanted rest. They wanted an end to struggle. Leora found herself studying this movement because she understood their feelings. After spending her life studying human failure, she knew why people became discouraged. The weight of history could become overwhelming. When she met the leader of the Quiet Path, a man named Tomas Aaron, she expected someone bitter. Instead, she found someone deeply compassionate. "I do not hate humanity," Tomas told her. "That is why I want us to stop hurting ourselves." Leora listened carefully. "And you believe stopping change will achieve that?" Tomas nodded. "Every great disaster began because someone wanted more." Leora considered his words. "And every great improvement began because someone believed tomorrow could be better." Tomas looked away. "You think hope is enough?" "No," Leora said. "Hope is not enough." She looked around his peaceful community. "But neither is surrender." Tomas frowned. "You call this surrender?" "Yes. Because you are giving up the possibility that people can learn." The conversation stayed with Tomas for a long time. Unlike the conflicts of previous eras, the struggle with the Quiet Path was not about defeating an enemy. It was about answering a difficult question. If humanity would always make mistakes, why continue trying? Leora found her answer in the oldest records of Kael'thir. She returned to the first archive beneath Valen and searched through the original writings. After many days, she found a forgotten sentence written in the margin of one of Kael's journals. It was not part of any famous speech. It was a private thought. "I do not fight because I believe the world will become perfect. I fight because people are worth protecting while they are still learning." Leora understood then that this was the heart of the entire legacy. Kael had never believed humanity would stop failing. He believed humanity was valuable despite its failures. She shared that discovery with Tomas. He did not change immediately. He spent months questioning everything he believed. Eventually, he visited communities outside his movement and saw something unexpected. He saw people struggling and still helping each other. He saw disagreement without destruction. He saw mistakes followed by repair. Slowly, the Quiet Path changed. They did not abandon their desire for peace. They abandoned the belief that peace required humanity to become smaller. They began helping communities create calmer, more balanced ways of living. Their movement transformed from one of withdrawal into one of restoration. Near the end of her life, Leora returned to Ardent Hollow. The village was no longer the same place Kael had known, yet the spirit of it remained. The old stone walls still stood. The names were still carved into it. Thousands of visitors came every year, not to worship heroes, but to remember choices. Leora sat before the wall and placed Ariavel's journals beside the names. She thought about all the people who had shaped history without ever knowing they were doing so. The warriors who protected villages. The healers who treated enemies. The teachers who preserved wisdom. The ordinary people who chose kindness when nobody rewarded them. She realized that the greatest misunderstanding about Kael'thir was that people believed he had become legendary because he was extraordinary. The truth was the opposite. He became legendary because he revealed what ordinary people were capable of. When Leora passed away, her students continued her work. They carried her research into new eras. They expanded the archives. They collected stories from distant worlds and unfamiliar cultures. Humanity continued exploring.
It continued changing. It continued making mistakes. But the old question remained alive. What makes a warrior?
Some answered with strength. Some answered with courage.
Some answered with wisdom.
But those who truly understood the history of Kale Ver gave a different answer. A warrior was someone who recognized that every person they met carried a story they did not yet understand. A warrior was someone who knew power without compassion was dangerous, and compassion without action was incomplete. A warrior was someone who accepted that the world would never be finished, never perfect, never simple, and still chose to protect it. The story that began with a boy searching for answers beneath the shadow of a fallen empire had traveled through countless generations. It had crossed borders, survived wars, inspired movements, challenged rulers, and changed the meaning of strength itself. Yet the final lesson remained exactly the same as it had been when Kale first stood alone against impossible odds. The world did not need someone who could never fall. It needed people willing to rise again and help others rise with them. And that was why the warrior who needed no magic was remembered forever. Not because he possessed a power beyond everyone else, but because he proved that the greatest power had always been something every person carried within themselves. The power to choose. The power to change. The power to remain human. Meant to believe. Ilara stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. You expect us to accept this because you say it? The stranger looked at her.
No. You should not accept anything because someone says it. That is how kingdoms fall. People stop searching for truth and start borrowing it. Boren crossed his arms. Then give us proof.
The stranger nodded toward the walls.
Look around. They did.
Kale had noticed the carvings earlier, but now he saw details he had missed.
The figures shown on the stone were not wielding glowing weapons or surrounded by magical symbols.
They were farmers, soldiers, craftsmen, and healers standing together against armies much larger than themselves. They carried ordinary tools turned into weapons.
Hammers. Spears. Broken shields. Hunting knives. The first warriors were not chosen, the stranger said. They chose themselves. Terran stared at the carvings. The Empire erased this.
Of course they did, the man replied. A ruler can control people who believe power belongs to someone else.
But a ruler cannot easily control people who understand they already possess the ability to fight back. Kale looked at him. Why tell me this now?
The stranger's expression changed. For the first time, the confidence disappeared.
Because the eclipse is in 12 days.
The chamber seemed colder.
What happens during the eclipse? Ilara asked.
The Empire activates the weapon beneath Blackstone Keep.
Boren looked around. A weapon?
The stranger shook his head.
Not a weapon. A machine.
Kale frowned.
Magic machines?
No, the man pointed to the carvings. A machine built by people who understood the same truth your father discovered. The human body and mind can be trained beyond what most believe possible. The Empire found those teachings and twisted them. They created soldiers who do not feel fear, who do not question orders, who obey until death.
Terran's face changed.
The blackguard.
The stranger nodded.
The elite soldiers everyone thinks are blessed by dark magic.
Kale remembered fighting them years earlier.
He remembered their impossible speed, their unnatural discipline, their ability to continue fighting after wounds that should have ended them. At the time, he believed they were monsters. Now he wondered if they had been something worse.
People turned into weapons. And my father? Kale asked. What did he have to do with this? The stranger looked toward the broken tablet.
Aron Ver helped create the original training methods. He believed they should be used to defend people, not control them. When the Empire discovered the techniques, they wanted the knowledge.
Your father destroyed the records and disappeared. Kale stared at the ground. Then why am I alive? The stranger did not answer immediately.
That hesitation told Kale more than words could have.
Because your father hid the final piece inside you. Ilara immediately looked at Kale. What does that mean? The stranger reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden box. He opened it carefully. Inside was a thin metal ring, darkened with age. Kale recognized it instantly. His mother had kept one exactly like it inside a locked drawer. He had found it once when he was young and asked what it was. She had taken it away and told him never to touch it again. The stranger held it toward him. Your father left this for you. Kale did not take it. Why now? Because he knew one day you would have to choose whether you wanted to become what others expected or remain who you truly are. You are speaking as if you know me. The stranger gave a tired smile. I know enough. I watched you train. I watched you fight. I watched you walk away from victories because you believed every victory cost too many lives. Kale's eyes narrowed. You followed me? I protected you. You watched me. The stranger accepted the accusation without defending himself. Yes. The answer unsettled Kale more than a denial would have. Before anyone could ask another question, a sharp sound echoed from above. Not thunder. Footsteps. Many footsteps. Taran moved toward the entrance. We were followed. The stranger's face hardened. They found us faster than expected. Boren lifted his hammer. How many? The man listened carefully. Enough. Kale drew his sword. The blade was plain, scratched, and repaired dozens of times. It had no symbols. No enchantments. No history anyone would sing about. But he trusted it. Who are they? Ilara asked. The stranger looked at Kale. The people you were told never existed. The first blackguard soldier entered the chamber moments later. He was tall, covered from head to toe in black armor, and moved with terrifying calm. Behind him came 5 more. They did not shout threats. They did not demand surrender. They simply advanced. Kale stepped forward. Stay behind me. Ilara immediately shook her head. No. Kale looked back. No? You heard me. She opened her medical bag and removed a small glass container filled with a pale blue liquid. I am a healer, not a person waiting to be protected. Boren smiled slightly. I like her. Taran raised his old military blade. That makes 4 of us. The stranger remained still. Kale noticed. Are you not fighting? The man looked at the approaching soldiers. I have fought them before. And I learned that strength alone does not defeat them. Kale tightened his grip. Then what does? The stranger looked at him. Understanding why they fight. The first blackguard reached them. Kale attacked immediately. His sword struck with precision, aimed at the joints of the armor rather than the metal itself. The soldier blocked effortlessly and countered with a speed that forced Kale backward. The impact shook his arm. This was not like fighting ordinary soldiers. The man moved without wasted motion. No anger. No panic. No instinctive reactions. Every movement was calculated. Kale changed tactics, using the narrow chamber to limit the soldier's advantage. He stepped aside, forced the warrior against the wall, and struck the helmet. The blackguard staggered for the first time. Behind him, Boren swung his hammer into another soldier's shield, creating a shockwave that sent dust falling from the ceiling. Ilara moved between injured fighters, not waiting for permission, using her knowledge of anatomy to disable opponents instead of killing them. She struck pressure points, damaged armor connections, and created openings. Taran fought differently. He was older and slower, but every strike carried the experience of someone who had survived too many wars. The battle became chaotic. The chamber filled with metal impacts, broken stone, and shouted warnings. Then Kale saw something that changed everything. One of the blackguard soldiers fell. His helmet cracked. Beneath it was not a monster. Not a creature. Not a mindless warrior. It was a young man.
Younger than Kale.
His eyes were terrified. "Help me," the soldier whispered.
Kale froze. The warrior grabbed his own head as if fighting against something inside his mind.
"Please."
The other blackguard soldiers ignored him. They continued attacking as if their fallen companion did not exist.
Kale understood then.
They were not fearless. They were trapped. The Empire had not removed their emotions. It had buried them.
"Do you see now?" the stranger shouted.
"They are victims too." Kale looked at the young soldier struggling on the floor. Years of hatred told him to finish the fight. Years of war told him mercy was a weakness. But another part of him, the part his father had left behind, made a different choice. He lowered his sword. The decision nearly killed him. A blackguard blade came toward his neck, and only Borin's hammer strike saved him at the last second.
"Are you trying to get yourself killed?"
Borin yelled.
Kale pushed the attacker back. "I am trying to end this differently."
"During a fight?"
Borin shouted.
"That is when people usually die." Kale ignored him and grabbed the fallen soldier's armor. He ripped away a small device attached beneath the collar. The soldier immediately collapsed, breathing heavily. The stranger stared at the device.
"You found it."
Kale held it up.
"This controls them."
"Yes." "Then Blackstone Keep is not protected by magic."
The stranger nodded.
"It is protected by thousands of people who do not know they are prisoners." A distant explosion shook the chamber.
The ceiling cracked.
More soldiers were coming. The group had minutes before they were surrounded. The stranger pointed toward a hidden passage behind the ancient tablet.
"That tunnel leads outside the city."
Kale looked at the unconscious soldier.
"We take him with us."
Taran looked surprised.
"A blackguard?"
"A person."
Nobody argued after that.
They escaped through the underground passage as Velmora collapsed behind them. Hours later, beneath the open sky, they watched smoke rise from the ruins. Kale stood apart from the others, holding the control device taken from the blackguard soldier. He had spent years believing the enemy was something simple. A force to defeat. A threat to destroy. But now the war had become something much harder. The enemy had faces.
Names. Families. The people standing against him might not all be enemies at all.
Ilara approached quietly. "You saved him because you believed he could change."
Kale looked at the unconscious soldier lying nearby.
"No, then why?"
"Because someone should have tried sooner."
Ilara looked toward the mountains.
"Blackstone Keep is waiting."
Kale closed his hand around the device. For the first time in years, he did not feel like a man walking toward a battle he could not win. He felt like a man walking toward a truth that could change everything. But far away, inside the highest tower of Blackstone Keep, the Emperor watched the same storm moving across the land. And beside him stood a figure wearing a mask identical to the one Kale had just removed from the fallen soldier. "He has found the first piece," the Emperor said.
The masked figure remained silent. "Should we stop him?" the Emperor asked.
After a long pause, the figure replied, "No." The Emperor turned.
"Why?"
The masked warrior removed the helmet slowly. Beneath it was a face Kale had not seen since childhood.
A face he believed belonged only to memory. "Because," the warrior said, "I want to see if my son is finally ready to kill me." The road to Blackstone Keep was no longer a path toward an enemy fortress.
It had become a journey into the buried history of Kale Vair's own life. Every mile north brought colder winds, harsher terrain, and memories that did not belong to him but seemed to wait along the road like ghosts. The mountains grew taller each day, their peaks hidden behind heavy clouds, and the forests beneath them became darker and quieter.
Even the animals seemed to avoid the region. Birds stopped singing before sunset. Wolves watched from a distance but never approached.
The land around Blackstone Keep felt like a place where nature itself had learned caution.
The unconscious blackguard soldier, whose name they discovered was Joran, woke on the second night after the escape.
He opened his eyes beneath a blanket beside the campfire and immediately reached for a weapon that was no longer there. Kale noticed the movement and raised his own hand, not toward his sword, but to signal everyone to remain calm.
Joran looked around in confusion.
His breathing became faster when he saw Kale.
"You," he whispered.
"You were supposed to die."
Kale sat across from him. "Apparently, I am difficult to kill." Joran did not laugh. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. "What did you do to me?" Kale held up the small control device. "I removed this." Joran's face changed. Fear replaced confusion. "Put it back."
Nobody expected those words.
Ilara stepped closer. "Why would you ask that?" Joran looked at her with exhausted eyes. "Because without it, I remember." The fire cracked between them. No one spoke. "Remember what?" Taran asked. Joran stared into the flames. "Everything." He swallowed. "Every village. Every person. Every order." "I followed." His voice became quieter. "The worst part was that I was awake the entire time." Kale watched him carefully. "How long have you been a blackguard?" 9 years. Borin shook his head. "You expect us to believe you had no choice for 9 years?" Joran looked at him. "You think a chain has to be made of metal to hold someone?"
The words silenced the group.
Joran explained what the Empire had done.
The blackguard were not created through magic, but through a combination of physical conditioning, psychological manipulation, and devices implanted into their armor. The control systems amplified fear, suppressed disobedience, and rewarded obedience with chemical responses that made following commands feel like survival. It was not a spell. It was a prison built inside the mind.
"Why tell us this?" Kale asked. Joran looked directly at him.
"Because the man leading the blackguard knows you are coming."
Kale's expression hardened. "The Emperor?" Joran shook his head. "No," he hesitated. "Your father." The camp became silent again.
Kale walked away from the fire. He had imagined finding his father many times throughout his life. In those fantasies, Arenver was either a hero returning from some impossible mission or a victim who had never gotten the chance to come home.
Kale had never imagined standing on opposite sides of a battlefield. "You saw him?" Kale asked. "Yes." "Alive?" "Yes." "Working for the Empire?" Joran looked down. "Not exactly."
Kale turned sharply.
"Explain." "Your father is not a prisoner."
"He is not a servant. He is the reason the blackguard exist."
The words struck harder than any physical blow. Kale refused to accept them. "That is impossible." "I thought so too," Joran replied. "Everyone does." The next morning, they continued toward the fortress with a new uncertainty following them.
Before, Kale had feared facing a powerful enemy. Now he feared facing a man he had spent his entire life trying to understand.
The group's dynamic changed during the journey.
Before Velmora, Kale had been the unquestioned leader, and the others had followed because they believed he knew the way.
Now they challenged him constantly. Borin questioned every plan. Ilara demanded explanations instead of accepting orders.
Taran stopped treating Kale like a soldier under his command and started treating him like an equal.
It irritated Kale at first.
Then, slowly, he realized something uncomfortable. He had spent years believing carrying every burden alone was a sign of strength. The people traveling with him were proving that strength could also come from allowing others to share the weight. On the 6th day, they reached the abandoned mining settlement of Hollow Ridge. The village had once supplied iron to the northern kingdoms, but now it sat empty beneath the shadow of Blackstone Keep. As they searched for supplies, they discovered signs that people had recently lived there.
Fresh footprints. Warm ashes. Food hidden underground. Someone is here, Ilara whispered.
Kale raised his sword.
Everyone stay alert.
A voice answered from the rooftops. That depends on whether you came here to help or finish what the Empire started. A group of villagers appeared, armed with old weapons and mining tools. Their leader was a woman named Sarah Voss, a former engineer from the Empire's weapons division. Unlike Kale, who carried himself like a warrior, Sarah looked like someone who had spent her life solving problems rather than fighting them. Her clothes were covered in dust, and her hands carried burns from years of working with machinery. You are hiding from the Empire, Kale said.
Sarah smiled without humor. Everyone is hiding from the Empire. She studied Joran.
But you brought one of their soldiers.
Joran lowered his head. I was one of them.
Sarah's expression changed.
Then you are exactly who we need. Kale immediately became suspicious. Why? She turned and led them into an underground workshop beneath the village.
Inside were dozens of broken Blackguard control devices, armor pieces, and machines.
Because I built some of these. Everyone looked at her. You worked for them? Ilara asked. Sarah nodded.
I helped design the systems that control the Blackguard. Her voice was steady, but her hands tightened.
I thought I was creating a way to end wars.
A system where soldiers could not betray their commanders, abandon civilians, or commit crimes because of anger and fear.
She looked at Joran. I told myself control could create peace. Joran stared at her. And did it? Sarah did not answer immediately. No, the honesty surprised everyone. It created obedience. There is a difference.
She showed them a map of Blackstone Keep.
The fortress was far more complex than they imagined. Beneath the visible towers was an enormous underground structure extending deep into the mountain.
The Empire built the fortress around the original research chambers, Sarah explained. The place where your father discovered the warrior teachings.
Kale looked at the map. And the prisoner beneath the fortress? Sarah's expression became serious. There is no prisoner. Terran stepped forward. The letter said there was.
The Empire spreads that rumor because it wants people searching for a person instead of the truth. She pointed to the deepest level of the fortress.
What they keep below Blackstone is not someone.
Kale leaned closer.
Then what? Sarah looked at him.
The first training chamber. A cold feeling passed through him.
Why hide a training chamber?
Sarah looked directly at Kale. Because anyone who completes the final stage can fight at a level that makes ordinary armies look helpless.
Borin frowned. You mean like magic?
No, Sarah replied. That is the lie people prefer.
Magic gives people an excuse.
It allows them to believe power comes from somewhere outside themselves.
She tapped the map. The truth is much more frightening.
The human body is capable of extraordinary things when pushed beyond normal limits.
Your father proved it. Kale stared at the fortress drawn on the map. And the Empire wants that knowledge. They already have most of it. Sarah paused. But they are missing the final lesson. Which is? She looked at him. The part your father refused to give them. Before Kale could ask more, the ground shook violently. Dust fell from the ceiling.
An alarm sounded above them, carried through hidden tunnels.
Sarah's face went pale. They found us. Joran stood. That is impossible. No patrol comes this far. A deep mechanical sound echoed beneath the village. Not footsteps. Not horses. Something heavier. Sarah rushed toward the entrance. Everyone underground. Now. Kale followed her outside instead.
On the horizon, a line of black armored vehicles moved through the snow toward Hollow Ridge. The Ashen Dominion had never used such machines openly.
Their existence had been another secret.
At the front of the army stood a single rider wearing no helmet.
Even from a distance, Kale recognized him. He knew the shape of his face. He knew the way he stood. He knew the sword hanging at his side. The man who had been a memory for most of Kale's life had returned. Arenvare stepped forward as the Empire's soldiers surrounded the village. Kale gripped his sword, but his hand did not move with anger. It moved with uncertainty. His father looked at him across the frozen battlefield. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Aren said something that Kale had waited 20 years to hear. "You became exactly what I hoped you would never become." Kale's eyes narrowed. "A warrior?" Aren shook his head.
No, the older man looked at the sword in Kale's hand.
"Someone who thinks he has to save the world alone."
The soldiers behind Aren raised their weapons. The village prepared for battle. And Kale realized the greatest fight waiting for him was not against the Empire, not against Blackstone Keep, and not even against the man standing across from him. It was against the possibility that the enemy had been right about him all along. Arenvare raised one hand, and the soldiers behind him stopped moving.
The silence that followed was more frightening than a charge.
Kale had faced armies before.
He understood the rhythm of battle, the shouting, the movement, the moment when fear turned into violence.
But this was different. The man standing in front of him was not behaving like a conqueror arriving to destroy a village. He looked like someone arriving at the end of a conversation that had begun long ago.
"You have questions," Aren said. Kale almost laughed.
The sound never came.
"I have 20 years of them." Aren looked away for a brief moment, and that small movement revealed something Kale did not expect. Regret. Not weakness. Not guilt. Something heavier. The kind of regret carried by someone who had made choices they could never undo. "Then ask."
Kale stepped forward.
"Why did you leave?"
The soldiers watched. The villagers watched. Everyone expected an answer filled with excuses or hidden plans.
Aren simply said, "Because staying would have gotten you killed." The answer angered Kale more than any lie could have. "You decided that for me?" "Yes." "You disappeared. You let me believe you were dead." "Yes." "You let me grow up thinking I was abandoned." Aren looked directly at him. "Yes."
The honesty stopped Kale for a moment. He had prepared himself to fight against denial. He had not prepared himself for someone willing to admit every wound they had caused.
"Why?" Kale demanded.
Aren looked toward the mountains.
"Because the Empire was not hunting me. It was hunting anyone connected to me. Your mother knew the danger.
She hated me for what I did, but she understood why."
Kale's jaw tightened. "She never forgave you."
No, Aren's voice became quieter. "She should not have." The answer unsettled him. Kale had imagined this moment countless times, but never like this. He had imagined accusing his father.
He had imagined hearing a heroic explanation. He had imagined anger finally finding a place to go.
Instead, he was standing across from a man who seemed to carry the same pain he did. "You created the blackguard," Kale said.
Aren did not deny it. "Yes."
The villagers reacted with anger.
Borin stepped forward. "Then every person they killed is on your hands." Aren looked at him. "Yes." Borin gripped his hammer. "You admit that?" "I do." "Then why should anyone believe you are different from the people you helped create?" Aren looked at the old blacksmith. "They shouldn't." The answer created confusion instead of trust.
Even Kale struggled to understand him.
"You expect us to believe you are guilty and still follow you?" Aren shook his head. "I expect nothing from you." He looked at Kale. "That was my greatest mistake.
I spent years believing I could decide what others needed.
I did it with your mother. I did it with my students. I did it with you."
A cold wind passed through the village. The moment someone believes they are the only person capable of making the right choice, they become dangerous.
Ilara watched Aran carefully.
She had spent most of the journey questioning Kale's tendency to carry everything alone, and now she was hearing the origin of that habit. "Then why are you here?" she asked. Aran turned toward Blackstone Keep.
"Because the Emperor is preparing to complete what I started." Sarah stepped out from the crowd.
The moment Aran saw her, his expression changed.
"You survived." Sarah looked at him with anger. "You sound disappointed." No, Aran shook his head. "I am relieved." "You should not be."
Her voice hardened.
"People died because of what we built." Aran accepted the accusation. "I know." "Do you?" Sarah moved closer.
"Do you know what it was like watching soldiers walk into villages wearing armor I
designed? Do you know what it was like hearing people call them monsters when I knew exactly how they were created?" Aran looked at her. "Yes." Sarah stopped. "Yes?"
"Because I watched my own son become someone who hated himself.
Because of what I left behind." Kale looked away.
He did not want those words to affect him, but they did. Before anyone could respond, a sound echoed from the mountains. A deep, mechanical roar that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Everyone turned toward Blackstone Keep. The highest tower of the fortress began to glow, not with magical light, but with thousands of tiny mechanisms activating beneath the stone.
Sarah's face changed instantly.
"They started it."
Aran looked at the fortress. "Earlier than expected." Taran pulled out his blade. "What started?" Aran answered without looking away. "The ascension process." Nobody spoke.
"The Empire has spent decades trying to remove every weakness from humanity," Aran continued.
"They believe emotion is a flaw. Doubt is a flaw. Compassion is a flaw.
They want warriors who never question orders."
Kale watched the fortress. "And the final stage?" Aran looked at him. "The final stage removes choice."
A terrible understanding spread through the group. The Empire was not trying to create better soldiers. It was trying to create soldiers who no longer possessed the ability to choose.
"How do we stop it?" Ilara asked. Aran looked at Kale. "You cannot." Kale's eyes hardened. "Then why are you here?" "Because you can."
Everyone turned toward him. Aran approached slowly and removed his sword from his belt. He placed it in the snow between them. It was an old weapon, far more worn than Kale expected. The blade had no decorations.
No symbols of rank.
It looked like a simple soldier's sword. "The last lesson your father left you was not hidden in a book," Aran said. "It was never a technique.
Never a secret movement. Never a way to become stronger than everyone else."
Kale stared at the sword.
"Then what was it?" Aran looked at him.
"Knowing when strength is not the answer." The words stayed with him. For years, Kale had trained harder because he feared weakness. He had improved because he feared failure. Every battle had been a test of whether he was enough. But perhaps that was the trap. Perhaps the Empire had created its own version of warriors by exploiting the same fear.
The need to become stronger.
The need to never lose.
The need to never trust anyone else.
Suddenly, the fortress did not seem like a place hiding power. It seemed like a monument built around a mistake. A mistake his father had made.
A mistake Kale had continued repeating. "What happens if we go inside?" Kale asked. Aran looked toward the dark gates of Blackstone Keep.
"You will face people who are stronger than you."
Kale nodded. "Good." Aran frowned slightly. "That is not the answer I expected." Kale picked up Aran's sword and handed it back to him.
"I spent years trying to become the strongest person in the room." He looked at Ilara, Boran, Taran, Joran, and Sarah.
"That is why I kept losing." Nobody spoke, but they understood.
For the first time since their journey began, Kale did not stand at the front alone.
He stood among them. The group entered Blackstone Keep before dawn. They did not attack through the main gate.
Sarah guided them through old maintenance tunnels beneath the mountain, pathways built by engineers who had designed the fortress before it became a symbol of fear. As they moved deeper underground, they discovered the true scale of the Empire's operation. Hundreds of blackguard soldiers were suspended inside chambers, their armor attached to machines that monitored their bodies and minds. Some were unconscious. Others stared blankly through glass walls, waiting for commands. Joran stopped walking. His face became pale. They are making more. Sarah nodded. Thousands. Cale approached one of the chambers. Inside was a young soldier, perhaps 16 years old. Too young to have chosen a battlefield. Too young to understand what was being taken from him. Cale placed his hand against the glass. We free them. Taran looked around nervously. That will trigger alarms. Cale nodded. Yes. Boran smiled faintly. You know, I preferred when your plans were simply dangerous.
Cale looked at him.
They were never simple.
They began opening the chambers. It was not a quiet rescue. Alarms erupted. Doors slammed open.
Soldiers rushed through corridors.
The fortress awakened around them. But something unexpected happened. The freed blackguard soldiers did not attack. Many collapsed. Some panicked. Some cried.
Some remembered what they had done and could not forgive themselves.
Cale did not tell them they were innocent. He did not tell them everything would be fine. He simply gave them a choice. If you want to leave, leave. If you want to fight, fight. But this time, decide for yourselves. It was the first command many of them had ever received that was actually freedom. Then the fortress shook. A massive door at the end of the corridor opened. Beyond it was the final chamber beneath Blackstone Keep. The place where the Empire had hidden the last piece of the warrior teachings. Inside stood a figure waiting beside an enormous machine. The Emperor. He wore no crown. No ceremonial armor. He looked like an ordinary man who had spent too many years believing he was saving the world. Aran, the Emperor said. You always did struggle with unfinished work. Aran stepped forward. And you always mistook control for peace. The Emperor ignored him and looked at Cale. You are the reason we are here. Cale raised his sword. No. You are here because you were afraid. The Emperor smiled slightly. You think this is about fear? He gestured toward the machines surrounding them. Look at history. Every war. Every betrayal. Every massacre. All caused by people choosing their own desires over order. Cale looked at the imprisoned soldiers behind him. So you removed choice. I removed suffering. You removed humanity. The Emperor's expression changed. Humanity is the cause of suffering. Cale stepped forward. No. People are the cause of suffering. But they are also the reason suffering can end. The Emperor looked almost disappointed. Your father taught you that? Cale shook his head. No, he looked back at Aran. He taught me what happens when someone forgets it. The machine behind the Emperor began powering up. The entire fortress trembled. The final stage had begun. And as the chamber filled with light from thousands of moving mechanisms, Cale realized the battle ahead would not be won by defeating the strongest warrior. It would be won by proving that a warrior who could choose was more powerful than one who could never disobey. The machine beneath Blackstone Keep roared with a sound unlike anything Cale had ever heard. It was not the sound of magic or some ancient force awakening. It was the sound of thousands of gears turning, pressure chambers opening, and systems built by human hands reaching the final stage of their purpose. The walls trembled as metal arms extended from the ceiling and connected with the armor of the remaining blackguard soldiers. Across the chamber, people who had only just regained control of their own minds began collapsing as the Empire attempted to reclaim them. Joran fell to one knee, gripping his head.
No, he whispered.
Not again.
Kale ran toward him, but Aaron stopped him.
Do not fight the machine the way it expects. Kale looked at him. What does that mean?
Aaron stared at the device controlling the chamber. It was designed to predict resistance.
Every warrior trained under this system responds the same way. Anger. Force. Violence.
The machine learns from conflict.
Kale watched the metal structures moving around them.
Then we do something it cannot predict. The Emperor heard him and smiled.
You still believe unpredictability is strength?
He stepped down from the platform. That was your father's mistake.
Aaron's face hardened. No.
My mistake was believing people could be improved by removing the parts that made them difficult.
The
Emperor walked closer.
And now you regret it because you were sentimental.
No, Aaron replied. I regret it because I was arrogant. The Emperor stopped.
For the first time, uncertainty appeared in his expression.
It was brief, but Kale noticed it. The Emperor had expected defiance. He had expected hatred. He had prepared for a war. He had not prepared for someone admitting failure.
Kale understood then that the Empire's greatest weapon was not the machine. It was certainty. The belief that one person could know what was best for everyone else. You spent your whole life trying to remove weakness from humanity, Kale said.
But you never understood where strength comes from.
The Emperor looked at him. And you do?
Kale glanced around the chamber. At the wounded soldiers. At the frightened villagers who had followed him. At his father, standing beside him despite everything between them. Strength comes from people who have the freedom to make the wrong choice and still choose the right one.
The Emperor's expression turned cold. A beautiful belief. A dangerous one.
He raised his hand. The machine responded instantly.
The chamber doors sealed shut.
Every blackguard soldier still connected to the system stood at once. Their movements were identical.
Perfect. Emotionless. The Emperor looked at Kale. Show me how your freedom defeats this.
The first wave of soldiers attacked.
Kale did not meet them with force.
He stepped aside. The first blackguard swung and missed.
The second followed.
Kale moved through the attacks instead of against them, guiding the soldiers' momentum away from him. He had fought stronger enemies before, but this was different. The old Kale would have tried to overpower them. He would have pushed harder, moved faster, tried to prove he belonged among the greatest warriors.
Now he watched. He listened. He looked for the people beneath the armor.
One soldier struck at him repeatedly with mechanical precision.
Kale noticed a small hesitation before every third strike. A tiny delay.
A moment where the person inside was fighting against the command. Instead of attacking, Kale lowered his weapon. The soldier froze.
You are still there, Kale said.
The soldier's hand trembled. The machine immediately increased its control. The soldier screamed and raised his blade again. Kale caught his wrist.
Not with anger. Not with force. With understanding. You do not have to obey.
The soldier's eyes filled with confusion.
I don't know how.
Then start with one decision.
The soldier looked at him. For several seconds, nothing happened.
Then the blade dropped from his hand.
Around the chamber, other soldiers began hesitating.
The Emperor's confidence disappeared.
Impossible.
Sarah, watching from the control platform, shouted, "The system is linked through shared responses.
If one breaks the pattern, others can recognize it."
The Emperor turned toward her. "You built this." Sarah looked at the machine with disgust.
"I built a tool."
"You built a prison." The Emperor moved toward the controls, but Taran intercepted him. Their blades clashed, and everyone in the chamber saw the difference between them. Terran was older, slower, and exhausted. The Emperor was younger, faster, enhanced by the machine's systems.
But Terran had something the Emperor lacked. Experience shaped by choice. You cannot win, the Emperor said while pushing him back. You are fighting against progress. Terran smiled slightly.
I have seen many men call their mistakes progress. Their fight moved across the platform as alarms continued screaming.
Meanwhile, Borin and Ilara worked with Sarah to disconnect the control systems. It was not simple.
The Empire had designed the machine so that destroying one section would overload another.
If we shut it down completely, Sarah said, the soldiers connected to it may not survive. Ilara looked at the hundreds of people trapped in the chambers. Then we do not shut it down. Sarah looked at her. What? We change it.
Sarah stared at her.
You think you can rewrite the entire system while it is active? Ilara looked at the control panels.
No, she picked up a tool from the ground.
I think we can give people enough time to wake up. It was a healer's solution, not a warrior's.
She did not try to destroy the machine.
She tried to save the people inside it.
Kale saw her working and understood something he had missed for years.
Warriors did not exist only on battlefields. Every person who protected another person was fighting in their own way.
The chamber shook violently as the machine reached maximum power. The Emperor pushed Terran aside and reached the central control column. You have no idea what you are risking, he shouted. If this fails, the world returns to chaos.
Kale approached him. Maybe.
The Emperor looked surprised.
Maybe? Kale nodded. Maybe people will make mistakes. Maybe they will fight. Maybe they will fail.
He stepped closer.
But they will also choose. And that is something you were never willing to risk.
The Emperor activated the final command.
Nothing happened.
He looked at the controls in confusion.
No, Sarah looked up from the platform. The system rejected you.
The Emperor stared at her.
That is impossible.
You designed it to recognize obedience, Sarah said. But the original system was built around trust between warriors.
You removed that part because you thought it was inefficient.
Kale looked at the machine.
The final lesson. Arin nodded slowly. Yes.
The Emperor turned toward him.
What did you hide? Arin looked at his son.
The ability to trust others.
The Emperor laughed bitterly. That is what you protected? That is what you could never understand. A sudden explosion interrupted them.
One of the fortress walls cracked open, revealing the storm outside. Snow and wind rushed into the chamber. The Emperor stumbled backward. The platform beneath him began collapsing.
Kale moved instinctively to save him. Everyone noticed. Even the Emperor. Kale grabbed his arm before he fell. For a moment, the two men hung above the destruction below.
The Emperor stared at him in disbelief.
Why?
Kale struggled to pull him upward.
Because letting you fall would prove you right. The Emperor looked confused. What?
You believe people are controlled by fear and selfishness. Kale pulled harder.
I am not going to become your proof. With the help of Terran and Borin, Kale dragged the Emperor back onto the platform. But the Emperor did not attack.
He simply sat there, staring at the warrior who had saved him. The man who should have hated him. The man who had every reason to let him die. Then the fortress shook again. This time, the damage was worse. The machine had been damaged beyond repair, and the entire underground structure began collapsing.
Sarah looked at the readings and went pale. We have minutes. Everyone began moving.
The freed soldiers helped carry the injured. Villagers guided people through escape routes.
No one waited for orders. No one asked who was in charge. They simply acted. Kale noticed the difference.
The Empire had created thousands of soldiers who followed commands perfectly. But here, surrounded by chaos, people were achieving something far more difficult. They were working together without being controlled. As they reached the outer tunnels, Arryn stopped.
Chaol noticed immediately. "What are you doing?" His father looked back toward the collapsing chamber. "Someone has to keep the final mechanism from activating." Chaol understood. No, Arryn looked at him. "Chaol."
No, for the first time, Chaol's voice carried anger that was not controlled.
"You do not get to disappear again." Arryn was silent.
Chaol stepped closer. "You spent my entire life deciding what sacrifices everyone else had to make.
You do not get to make this one alone."
The older man looked at him, and something in his expression broke.
Not dramatically. Not like a warrior defeated in battle.
Like a father finally realizing his son was no longer a child waiting for him to return. "You sound like your mother," Arryn said quietly.
Chaol almost smiled. She was usually right.
Arryn laughed softly, perhaps for the first time in years. Then the ground beneath them collapsed.
The tunnel split apart.
A massive piece of stone fell between Chaol and Arryn, separating them.
"Arryn!"
Chaol shouted. Through the dust, his father's voice answered.
"Go. I am not leaving you. Listen to me." The collapse grew louder.
The world does not need another warrior who sacrifices himself because he thinks he has to. Chaol froze.
Arryn continued. "That was the lesson I failed to learn."
The passage began closing.
"Now learn it for me."
Chaol stood there, fighting every instinct telling him to break through the stone. Then he heard voices behind him.
People needed help. The soldiers needed guidance.
The escape route was collapsing. For the first time in his life, Chaol made the hardest choice a warrior could make.
He trusted someone else. He stepped away. The survivors escaped Blackstone Keep as the fortress collapsed behind them. The mountain swallowed the Empire's greatest weapon, burying decades of secrets beneath stone and snow.
But when the sun rose the next morning, the war was not over. Across the continent, armies still marched.
Cities still suffered.
The Ashen Dominion still existed. Yet something had changed.
The story people told about warriors began changing too.
They stopped speaking about chosen heroes and impossible powers. They started speaking about ordinary people who stood together. And far beneath the ruins of Blackstone Keep, where no one believed anyone could survive, a single light appeared in the darkness.
Not magical. Not mysterious.
A small flame from a simple torch. And beside it, a wounded man picked himself up from the rubble and whispered one word into the empty tunnels.
Chaol.
Chaol spent the first hour after escaping Blackstone Keep convinced that the silence following the collapse was the loudest sound he had ever heard. The battlefield noises he knew, the clash of weapons, the cries of wounded soldiers, the commands shouted by desperate leaders had always filled the air with a terrible certainty. There was always an enemy to face, a direction to move, a decision waiting to be made. But standing on the frozen slopes outside the ruined fortress, staring at the mountain that had swallowed his father, Chaol felt surrounded by a silence that offered no answers. The survivors gathered below the cliffs where the snow had been stained with ash and dust. Hundreds of freed blackguard soldiers stood among villagers, engineers, and former enemies who no longer knew exactly where the lines between them were supposed to be. For generations, the world had been divided by banners and armies. Now those banners looked less important than the people standing beneath them. Joran sat beside a fire with several other former blackguard soldiers. He had not spoken much since the escape. The memories returning to him had become a burden heavier than the armor he once wore. He remembered every village raid. Every order. Every face of someone who had begged him to stop. No one knew what to say to him. Some survivors hated him. Some pitied him. Some simply avoided him. Chaol understood why. Forgiveness was not something that could be demanded. A person could choose to change, but they could not erase the damage they had caused. When Chaol approached him, Joran looked away. If you came to tell me I did the right thing by helping you, Joran said quietly, don't.
Kale stopped beside him. I wasn't going to. Joran looked surprised.
Kale continued, you did one good thing.
That matters.
But it does not erase everything else. The former soldier stared at the fire.
Then why are you here? Because I need your help. Joran frowned. After everything I did? Because you know the Empire better than anyone here. Joran gave a bitter laugh. You still trust people too easily.
Kale looked toward the wounded soldiers nearby.
No. I trust people carefully now.
That answer made Joran look at him.
Kale continued, trust is not pretending. Someone has never done anything wrong.
It is believing they can choose what they do next.
Joran lowered his head.
It was not forgiveness. It was not peace. But for the first time since waking from the control system, he looked like someone who believed tomorrow might exist. Meanwhile, Ilara worked through the survivors with the same relentless focus she had shown throughout the journey. She moved from person to person, checking wounds, organizing supplies, and refusing to allow anyone to treat her as anything less than essential. When Kale found her, she was repairing a soldier's damaged arm beside a broken wagon. You should rest, he said. Without looking up, she replied, you should stop giving advice you never follow.
Kale almost smiled.
Fair. She tied the bandage and finally looked at him. Her expression softened when she saw his face.
You thought he was dead. Kale looked back toward the mountain. I do not know what I think. That is new for you. I usually know what I think. Ilara raised an eyebrow. You usually decide what you think before anyone else gets a chance to speak. Kale considered arguing, then stopped. You are right. Ilara paused.
She had become used to him resisting every criticism. Hearing him accept one so easily surprised her.
That might be the most dangerous thing you have ever done. Admitting you are right?
Yes.
A small smile appeared between them before the seriousness returned. What happens now?
Kale looked across the camp. Former enemies were sharing food. Injured soldiers were helping repair equipment. People who had spent years being told to hate one another were sitting side by side because survival had forced them to see each other differently. Now we tell the truth. The first step toward changing a world built on lies was revealing the lies.
Sarah helped them recover records from the fortress before the collapse.
They discovered documents proving the Empire had manipulated conflicts across the continent for decades. The Ashen Dominion had not conquered nations because it was stronger. It had created fear, then used that fear to justify control. It had supported wars between kingdoms, weakened alliances, and offered itself as the only solution to problems it secretly helped create. When the evidence was shown to the leaders of nearby regions, many refused to believe it at first. Some called it rebellion propaganda. Others accused Kale of attempting to create his own kingdom. He expected resistance. He did not expect how quickly people would choose comfort over truth. The first city council that received the documents spent 3 days debating whether exposing the Empire would create more chaos than leaving the people unaware. Kale attended the meeting but said little. Years earlier, he would have walked into the chamber and demanded action. He would have believed urgency justified force. Instead, he listened. He watched leaders struggle with impossible decisions. He saw that ruling was not simply choosing what was right. It was choosing what consequences people were willing to carry. After the meeting ended without a decision, Kale walked outside frustrated. Boren followed him. You look angry.
I am.
Why? Kale stared at the city walls. Because they know the truth and they are still afraid to act.
Boren leaned against his hammer. And? Kale looked at him. And what? And why does that surprise you?
Kale frowned.
Boren smiled slightly.
You spent years fighting people who had already made their choices. You forgot most people spend their lives trying to figure out which choice will hurt less.
Kale was quiet. You have become annoyingly wise. Borin laughed. I am a blacksmith.
I have spent 40 years hitting metal until it becomes useful.
People are not much different.
The rebuilding of the Northern Alliance began slowly. Not with grand speeches or celebrations, but with small decisions. Villages opened their doors to former blackguard soldiers who had
nowhere else to go.
Engineers who had worked for the Empire began using their knowledge to repair cities instead of building weapons.
Healers trained new apprentices. Soldiers learned tactics based on protection rather than conquest.
But peace was fragile.
The emperor had disappeared during the collapse.
Some believed he died.
Others believed he escaped.
Kale never believed either. Men like that did not vanish simply because their plans failed.
They adapted. They waited.
3 weeks after Blackstone Keep fell, a messenger arrived at the northern camp carrying a sealed letter.
The symbol on the envelope was not the Empire's symbol.
It was the symbol of the Old Kingdom. Kale opened it carefully. Inside was a message written in a hand he recognized immediately.
Aran was alive.
The letter was short.
The Emperor survived.
He took the remaining blackguard command and moved south. He is not trying to rebuild the Empire.
He is trying to prove that everything we fought for was wrong. He believes freedom always returns people to violence. He intends to create a final war so devastating that the world will beg for control again.
You cannot defeat him by becoming stronger than him.
That is what he wants. Find the people who still believe choice matters. The letter ended with a location.
A city called Valen, the birthplace of the first warriors.
Kale read the message twice.
Then he folded it and placed it inside his coat.
Ilara approached. Bad news?
Yes.
How bad?
Kale looked toward the south.
The kind where we need everyone.
That evening, he gathered the survivors of Blackstone Keep. The former soldiers.
The villagers. The engineers. The fighters. The healers.
Everyone who had become part of the Impossible Alliance. When Kale spoke, he did not stand on a platform.
He did not wear armor.
He did not hold a sword. I used to believe a warrior was someone who stood between danger and everyone else, he said.
I was wrong. The crowd listened. A warrior is not the person who fights alone.
A warrior is the person who chooses what they are willing to protect.
He looked at the people around him.
The Empire wanted us to believe we needed someone powerful enough to save us. They wanted us to wait for heroes.
He shook his head. We are not waiting anymore.
The journey south began 2 days later. But before leaving, Kale returned to the mountain where Blackstone Keep had fallen.
He went alone.
Beneath the snow, he found the old sword Aran had carried. The blade was damaged but intact.
Kale picked it up and looked at his reflection in the metal. He expected to feel anger. He expected to feel grief.
Instead, he felt something quieter.
Acceptance.
His father had spent years trying to protect him by leaving.
Kale had spent years trying to prove he did not need anyone.
Both had been wrong. Protection without trust became control.
Independence without connection became isolation.
The lesson was not that warriors did not need strength. The lesson was that strength without humanity eventually became another form of weakness. As Kale turned away from the mountain, he heard movement behind him. He reached for his sword. A figure stepped from the trees.
Aran.
Older.
Wounded. Exhausted. But alive. Neither man spoke for several seconds.
Then Kale said the only thing that mattered.
You made me walk away. Aran nodded. Yes. I hated you for that. I know. Kale looked at him. I still do sometimes. Aran accepted it. That is fair.
The honesty made Kale lower his guard.
Why did you come back?
Aaron looked toward the road where the others waited in the distance.
Because I finally understood something. What?
A father's job is not to choose his child's path.
Aaron looked at him.
It is to walk beside them when they choose it.
Cale stood silently.
Then he handed Aaron the damaged sword.
Good. Aaron looked confused. Good? Cale nodded toward the road. Because we have a long walk ahead. For the first time in 20 years, father and son walked in the same direction. Not because the past was forgiven.
Not because every wound had healed. But because the future required something neither of them had been willing to do before.
They had to face it together.
And far to the south, beneath the towers of Valen, the Emperor prepared his final move. He no longer had an army of perfect soldiers. He no longer had the machine beneath Blackstone Keep. But he had discovered something far more dangerous. He had found thousands of people who were afraid of freedom. And he intended to convince them that fear was the only thing keeping the world alive. The journey to Valen took 18 days, but for Cale it felt like traveling through a lifetime that belonged to someone else. The roads they crossed had once been filled with merchants, travelers, and children running between villages. Now many paths were abandoned. The Ashen Dominion had withdrawn from several regions after the fall of Blackstone Keep, but the damage remained. Empty homes stood with doors open to the wind. Fields grew wild because farmers had been forced into armies or had fled from battles. Old battlefields appeared without warning, marked only by rusted weapons half buried in the soil. Every place they passed carried evidence of the same truth: wars did not end when the fighting stopped. They continued in the memories of those left behind. Cale noticed the difference in himself during those days. In the past, he would have walked through destroyed villages searching for enemies. He would have studied footprints, counted supplies, predicted attacks. He still did those things, but now he noticed other details. He noticed a woman rebuilding a broken fence around a farm even though half the village was gone. He noticed children teaching each other games using pieces of discarded armor. He noticed old soldiers carrying injured strangers across roads they once marched through as invaders. The world was wounded, but it was not empty. That realization became more important than any battle skill he had learned. The group traveled with a growing number of people who had chosen to join them. Not soldiers. Not an army. People. Some were former blackguards who wanted a chance to repair the harm they had caused. Some were villagers who refused to wait for someone else to decide their future. Some were ordinary workers who had never held a weapon before but believed silence had allowed the empire to grow. Cale struggled with this at first. He worried about leading people into danger. He worried about failing them. He worried that every person following him was another person he might lose. Ilara noticed before anyone else. One evening, while they rested beside a river, she found him studying maps alone. "You are doing it again," she said. Cale did not look up. "Doing what?" "Trying to carry everyone." He folded the map. "Someone has to plan. Planning is not the problem." She sat beside him. "You are trying to predict every possible disaster so you can blame yourself before it happens." Cale was quiet. "That sounds ridiculous." "It is." He looked at her. "Thank you for the support." "You are welcome." She smiled briefly. "But it is also true." Cale looked toward the camp. People were laughing around small fires. Joran was teaching former soldiers how to repair equipment. Boran was arguing with engineers about whether a bridge design was beautiful or merely functional. Taran was training younger fighters, but unlike his old military lessons, he focused on survival and protecting others rather than victory. "I am not used to people depending on me," Cale admitted. Ilara shook her head. "That is not what scares you." He waited. "You are used to people depending on the warrior. You do not know what to do when they depend on the person." Cale looked away. The statement hit harder because it was accurate. For most of his life, people had praised him for being strong. They had respected his ability to endure pain, fight longer, and continue when others stopped. But nobody had ever taught him how to simply exist without proving his value. You know, Ilara said, you do not have to become your father.
Kale looked at her. I know. Do you? He did not answer. The city of Valen appeared on the 22nd day.
It was unlike any place Kale had seen before. Built between two massive cliffs, the city had survived countless wars because its founders believed knowledge was more valuable than walls.
Ancient towers held records from thousands of years. Bridges connected buildings at different heights.
Gardens grew on rooftops. It was the birthplace of the first warrior schools, not because warriors had trained there to become stronger than everyone else, but because they had gathered there to learn how to serve communities.
Yet when Kale entered the city, he found it divided.
The emperor had reached Valen before them. He had not attacked the city. He had done something far more effective. He had convinced many citizens that surrender was safety. Large banners hung across the streets displaying the old symbol of the Ashen Dominion alongside a new message. Peace requires order. The phrase appeared everywhere.
On walls. On buildings. On public notices. The emperor was not hiding anymore.
He was selling his belief openly. The city council had invited him to speak, and thousands had gathered to hear him. Kale and his companions entered secretly through old tunnels beneath the city, guided by historians who still believed the truth mattered. One of them was an elderly scholar named Master Oren Vale, a man who had spent his entire life studying the origins of the warrior traditions. When he met Kale, he stared for a long moment.
You look like him. Kale immediately became cautious. My father? Oren nodded.
But you do not stand like him.
Kale frowned. What does that mean?
The old scholar smiled.
Oren always stood like a man preparing for the next battle. You stand like someone wondering whether there should be a battle at all. That observation stayed with Kale. Oren led them into the oldest chamber beneath Valen, a place untouched by the Empire's influence.
On the walls were records from the earliest days of civilization.
Not legends. Not myths.
Actual history. The first warriors had never been in order. They had never been soldiers serving kings. They were people who appeared whenever societies became controlled by fear. Farmers who protected villages from raiders.
Teachers who defended knowledge from destruction. Healers who entered battlefields to save enemies as well as allies.
The Empire misunderstood the first warriors, Oren explained. They thought the lesson was about creating stronger fighters. He touched an ancient carving.
The lesson was about creating stronger people. Sarah studied the inscriptions. Then why did Oren hide the knowledge? Oren looked at Kale. Because knowledge without wisdom becomes a weapon.
Kale thought about the blackguard.
About the machine. About the emperor.
Every piece of the conflict connected. The Empire had taken a truth and corrupted it. It had discovered that humans could become stronger and decided the solution was removing everything inconvenient about being human.
The Emperor knows this place exists, Taran said. Oren nodded. He wants what is beneath it.
Kale looked toward the floor.
There is something beneath Valen? The scholar hesitated.
The first training chamber.
Everyone became silent. Another one? Boren asked. Oren nodded.
Blackstone Keep contained the corrupted version.
Valen contains the original. Kale immediately understood. He is not trying to destroy it.
Oren looked at him. No, he wants to prove his way is better.
Exactly.
The Emperor had no interest in hiding the truth anymore. He wanted to stand in the birthplace of the warrior teachings and rewrite their meaning forever.
That evening, Kale attended the Emperor's speech from the crowd.
He wore no armor and carried no visible weapon.
He wanted to hear the argument directly. The Emperor stood on the central platform beneath the ancient towers. He looked calm. Almost peaceful. For generations, the emperor said, people have suffered because they were told freedom was sacred. But what is freedom without safety? What is choice without responsibility? Many citizens listened carefully. Some nodded. I do not hate humanity, the emperor continued. I have spent my life trying to save it from itself. Kale watched the crowd. The frightening thing was that some people believed him. Not because they were evil. Because they were tired. Tired people often accepted simple answers. The emperor continued. Every person here knows the truth. Your neighbors can become your enemies. Your leaders can betray you. Your friends can abandon you. Chaos is not a theory. It is history. Then he paused. But I can end it. The crowd became silent. No more wars between nations. No more soldiers who disobey. No more children losing parents because someone wanted revenge. All it requires is one sacrifice. The emperor looked toward the ancient tower behind him. Choice. A murmur moved through the crowd. Kale stepped forward. And who decides what people sacrifice next? The crowd turned. The emperor smiled when he saw him. There you are. Guards immediately moved, but the emperor raised his hand. Let him speak. Kale walked into the open square. For a moment, thousands of eyes watched him. The old Kale would have felt the pressure. He would have searched for the perfect words. The perfect strategy. The perfect way to win. Instead, he simply told the truth. He is right about one thing. The crowd became restless. The emperor looked pleased. Kale continued. People hurt each other. They make terrible choices. They fail. He looked around the square. But he forgot something. The emperor's smile faded slightly. What? Kale answered, people also change. A quietness spread through the crowd. I have fought soldiers who were told they were monsters. I have met people who did terrible things because they were controlled, afraid, or convinced they had no other option. But I have also seen them choose differently. He looked at Joran among the crowd. I have seen people who caused harm spend every day trying to repair it. The emperor stepped down from the platform. You think a few examples prove anything? No. Kale shook his head. They prove something better. He looked directly at him. They prove you are not the only person who gets to decide what humanity becomes. The emperor's expression hardened. The crowd began whispering. For the first time, the emperor's control over the moment weakened. Then the ground beneath the city shook. A deep sound came from below. The ancient chamber beneath Valen had opened. The emperor turned toward the tower. Finally. Kale saw the realization on his face. The emperor had not come to convince people alone. He had come to activate the original training chamber and combine it with his own technology. Sarah looked terrified. If he merges the two systems, Kale looked at her. What happens? She swallowed. He creates exactly what your father feared. The city trembled again. Ancient mechanisms awakened beneath Valen. The emperor walked toward the entrance, surrounded by loyal soldiers. You wanted to see what humanity could become without limits, he said to Kale. Now you will. Kale drew his sword. Around him, people began choosing sides. Not because they were commanded. Not because they were controlled. Because they believed something mattered. And as the doors beneath Valen opened, revealing the oldest secrets of the warrior tradition, Kale understood the final battle would not decide who was stronger. It would decide whether humanity deserved the freedom to choose its own future. The doors beneath Valen opened slowly, revealing a staircase that descended farther than anyone expected. The ancient builders of the city had not created the chamber beneath the tower as a hidden vault or a place to store weapons. They had built it as a place of learning. The walls were covered with carvings showing people from different lands, different cultures, and different generations standing together. There were no kings above them. No chosen figures at the center.
The oldest records of the warrior tradition had never been about one person becoming powerful enough to protect everyone else. They were about communities becoming strong enough to protect one another.
The emperor walked down the stairs first, his soldiers following behind him. He did not rush. He moved like a man entering a place where he believed he had already won.
Kael followed at a distance with Aren, Ilara, Sarah, Joran, Boran, and Taran beside him. The city above was preparing for conflict, but beneath the streets, the final struggle had already begun. He believes this chamber will prove him right, Aren said quietly.
Kael looked at the ancient walls. Will it? Aren took a long breath. That depends on what he finds. You do not know? Kael asked. His father shook his head. I never completed the final trial. Kael looked at him. You built all of this, but you never finished? Aren looked toward the darkness ahead. Because I realized I was asking the wrong question. Ilara glanced at him. What question?
I spent my life asking how strong a person could become.
Aren's voice lowered. I should have asked why.
They reached the bottom of the chamber and found a vast circular room. At its center stood a simple stone platform. Unlike the machines beneath Blackstone Keep, there were no wires, no metal arms, no control systems. There was only a single inscription carved into the stone. Sarah approached and translated the ancient words. The warrior who seeks victory over others will eventually become their enemy. The warrior who seeks victory over themselves may become a guardian.
The emperor entered the chamber from the opposite side.
He had heard the words. Beautiful, he said.
And useless.
Kael turned toward him.
Why? The emperor walked around the platform. Because people do not live according to ideals.
They live according to fear, hunger, jealousy, and anger.
Your ancient warriors were lucky.
They existed in stories.
I have lived in reality. Aren stepped forward. Reality is not an excuse to abandon what is right. The emperor looked at him. That is exactly the kind of thing that ruined you. His gaze moved to Kael. Your father believed people could be trusted.
He created methods to make warriors stronger, then became afraid of what those methods could become. He touched the stone platform. I had the courage to finish what he started.
Kael looked at the emperor. No.
You had the fear to finish what he started.
The emperor's expression tightened. You still think fear is weakness? No, Kael replied. Fear is human.
The answer surprised him.
Kael continued, the problem is when fear makes people believe they have the right to control everyone else.
The emperor looked toward the platform. You came here to stop me, but you still do not understand what this place does.
He stepped onto the stone.
This chamber reveals potential. It shows what a person can become when every limitation is removed.
Sarah moved forward. That is not what it was designed for. The emperor smiled. You never understood it. I understood enough to know it should never be used on anyone without consent. The emperor ignored her. The chamber began responding.
Unlike Blackstone Keep, there was no violent activation.
No alarms. No mechanical force. The ancient room simply recognized the person standing within it. Light spread across the carvings. The emperor closed his eyes. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then he opened them.
Something had changed.
Not physically. He was not transformed into a monster or some impossible warrior. He simply looked more certain than before. Too certain.
I see it now, he whispered. Kael watched carefully.
See what? The emperor looked around the chamber. Every possible outcome. Aren's expression changed. No, the emperor smiled. Yes. He looked at Kael.
The chamber does not create strength.
It reveals understanding. He stepped forward. I can see every decision people might make. Every war. Every betrayal. Every moment where freedom creates suffering. Kale realized the danger. The chamber had not given the Emperor power. It had given him exactly what he always wanted. Proof. You think seeing possibilities means you know the future, Kale said. The Emperor looked at him. It means I understand patterns. Patterns are not people. People are patterns. Kale shook his head. No. People are choices. The Emperor laughed softly. That is why you will always lose. He raised his hand. His soldiers moved forward. But then something unexpected happened. One of them stopped. It was a young woman wearing the black armor of the remaining blackguard. She looked toward Kale, then toward the Emperor. My lord, she said uncertainly. The Emperor turned. Advance. She did not move. Why? The Emperor stared at her. What did you say? The soldier's hands trembled. Why are we fighting? The chamber went silent. The Emperor's face became cold. Because I ordered it. The soldier looked down. That was never enough before. Another soldier stepped back. Then another. The Emperor's belief in perfect control began to crack. You do not understand what you are doing, he said. The first soldier removed her helmet. Actually, I think I finally do. She looked at Kale. I am choosing. The Emperor turned toward the ancient platform. The chamber showed me this would happen. Kale looked at him. Then you should have known. Known what? That people are not machines. The Emperor's anger finally appeared. Not rage. Something more desperate. Do you think this is proof of your beliefs? A few people choosing against me? He pointed toward the city above. There will always be conflict. There will always be suffering. You cannot change that. Kale nodded. You are right. Everyone looked at him. Even the Emperor seemed surprised. Kale continued, I cannot remove suffering from the world. He stepped closer. Neither can you. The Emperor stared. Then what is the difference? Kale looked at the people around him. The difference is I do not need to. The words struck the chamber harder than any weapon. The Emperor had spent his entire life trying to solve the existence of pain. He had turned people into tools because he believed pain itself was the enemy. But pain was not the enemy. Cruelty was. Fear was. The refusal to care was. The chamber beneath Valen began to change. The light surrounding the Emperor faded. Sarah looked at the platform. It is rejecting him. Aren shook his head. No, everyone looked at him. It is showing him something he does not want to see. The Emperor staggered slightly. For the first time, he looked afraid. What did you do? Kale asked. Nothing. Aren looked at his former creation. The chamber does not judge people. It only reveals what they refuse to face. The Emperor looked around the room. The carvings on the walls began changing. Not physically, but in his perception. The chamber showed him memories. Not victories. Not strategies. The moments he had ignored. The faces of people hurt by his decisions. The soldiers who lost their lives because he considered them acceptable losses. The children who grew up without parents because he called their suffering necessary. Stop, the Emperor whispered. Nobody moved. Stop, he shouted. His voice echoed through the chamber. Kale saw something he never expected. The Emperor was not angry. He was grieving. For the first time, the man who had tried to control the world was forced to see it as individual lives instead of numbers. Aren stepped toward him. This is what I saw years ago. The Emperor looked at him. And you ran? Aaron nodded. Yes. Why? Aaron looked at Kale. Because I was not ready to. Forgive myself. The Emperor stared at him. And now? Aaron looked back. Now I understand forgiveness is not something you earn by pretending your mistakes never happened.
It is something you seek by making different choices afterward.
The Emperor lowered his head. The battle that everyone expected never happened. There was no final sword strike. No dramatic defeat.
No victory shouted across a battlefield. Instead, the most dangerous man in the world stood in the center of an ancient chamber and finally faced the consequences of his own beliefs. But outside, above the city, the war was not finished. The Emperor's remaining forces still controlled parts of Valen.
Some commanders refused to surrender. Some citizens still believed control was safer than freedom.
The struggle had moved beyond one man.
It had become a question every person had to answer for themselves.
As Kale and the others returned to the surface, they found the city divided but standing.
The people looked at them, waiting. They expected a declaration. A command. A new leader. Kale looked at the crowd and realized this was the moment where old warriors would have made their greatest mistake. They would have stepped forward and claimed responsibility for the future. Instead, Kale simply said, "The choice belongs to all of you." The crowd was silent. Then an old woman from the edge of the street raised her voice. "And what happens if we choose wrong?" Kale looked at her. It was the same question that had guided the Emperor's entire life. The fear of making mistakes. Kale answered honestly. "Then we learn." The woman nodded slowly. Another person stepped forward. Then another. Not everyone agreed. Not everyone trusted. But people began talking. Not obeying. Talking. It was messy. Slow. Difficult. Human.
Weeks later, historians would write that the fall of the Ashen Dominion was not caused by the defeat of an emperor. It was caused by ordinary people realizing they no longer needed someone else to decide their worth. But Kale knew the truth was more complicated. The empire had not fallen because everyone became good. It fell because enough people finally believed they had the responsibility to try. And somewhere beyond the rebuilt cities and changing borders, a new generation began learning a different kind of warrior tradition. They were not trained to become unstoppable. They were not taught to conquer fear. They were taught to understand it. They were not told that strength meant standing above others. They were taught that strength meant standing beside them. Years later, when children asked Kale why he had become famous, he always gave the same answer. "I did not become famous because I was the strongest warrior." The children would usually argue, because legends had already grown around him. They would tell stories about battles he won, armies he defeated, and impossible moments where he survived against overwhelming odds. Kale would smile and shake his head. "Those are not the reasons." "Then why?" they would ask. And he would look toward the people around him, the healers, builders, former soldiers, teachers, and families who had rebuilt a broken world, and say, "Because I finally learned I did not have to be." The world remembered many warriors after the war. Some were stronger. Some were faster. Some became legends. But the name that endured longest was not remembered because Kale had magic, because he never did. It was remembered because when the world demanded a weapon, he chose to remain a person. And that was why he became the warrior who needed no magic. The centuries after Talleyrand's era became known as the Age of Living Memory, a time when the world began to understand that history was not something stored only in books and monuments. It was something carried by people. The lessons of Kale had survived because each generation had interpreted them through its own struggles. The world did not preserve his story by keeping it unchanged. It preserved it by allowing it to evolve. Some scholars believed that was the final proof that Kale's teachings had succeeded. A rigid idea could survive only by force. A living idea survived because people continued choosing it. Yet even in this age of greater understanding,
humanity faced a challenge unlike anything before. The greatest threats no longer came from armies
seeking territory or rulers seeking absolute control. The new dangers came from complexity itself. The world had become so connected that a decision made in one distant region could affect millions of lives elsewhere.
A discovery could transform society overnight. A mistake could spread farther than any army in history. People began asking a question that had haunted humanity since the time of the Ashen Dominion: how much responsibility could individuals carry in a world larger than they could understand? In the center of this debate was a young guardian named Elias Thorne. Unlike the warriors of ancient stories, Elias had never dreamed of becoming a hero. He had entered the guardian path because his older sister had once told him that the world needed more people willing to solve problems before they became disasters. Elias had believed her. But as he grew older, he discovered that solving problems was far more difficult than he expected. There was rarely a perfect answer. There were only choices with consequences. His first major assignment involved a coastal region facing a devastating environmental crisis. The sea levels had risen unexpectedly, threatening thousands of homes. Engineers had developed a solution that could protect the largest cities by redirecting water patterns. However, smaller island communities would suffer as a result. The decision seemed impossible. Protect millions in the cities and harm thousands elsewhere, or protect smaller communities and risk a larger disaster. Previous generations might have searched for a leader who could make the choice. Elias remembered Cale's lesson. The first mistake of power was believing difficult decisions belonged only to the powerful. So instead of presenting a solution, Elias traveled to every affected community. He listened to fishermen who feared losing their homes. He spoke with city workers who feared losing their families. He met engineers who had spent years developing the plan and felt personally responsible for every possible outcome. After months of discussion, they created a different solution. It was slower. It cost more. It required sacrifices from everyone. But it protected more people and allowed communities to adapt together. When critics asked why Elias had spent so much time negotiating when a faster decision could have been made, he answered, "Because people are not numbers waiting to be calculated." That sentence became one of the defining statements of the era. But not everyone accepted this philosophy. Some argued that humanity had become too cautious. They believed cooperation and discussion delayed necessary action. A movement called the Pure Order began gaining influence, claiming that the world needed stronger leadership and fewer disagreements. Their leader, Alor Vaz, was a brilliant strategist who believed history had become trapped in endless debate. He studied every major crisis of the past and reached a conclusion that seemed logical to many people. Humanity suffers because it cannot decide quickly enough, he said. The future belongs to those willing to act. Unlike the old emperors, Alor did not promise perfection. He promised efficiency. He argued that a small group of highly trained decision-makers could prevent disasters faster than communities filled with disagreement. Many people supported him because his ideas sounded practical. They were tired of long debates. They were tired of uncertainty. They wanted someone to say, "This is the answer." Elias was assigned to meet with Alor before the movement grew further. When they spoke, Elias found the conversation surprisingly calm. Alor was not cruel. He was thoughtful. He genuinely believed he was protecting people. "You think I am another emperor," Alor said. Elias shook his head. "No, then what am I?" Elias considered the question. "Someone who sees a real problem and believes there is only one way to solve it." Alor smiled slightly. "And you believe there are many ways?" "I believe there are many people who deserve a voice." Alor leaned back. "And if those voices create failure?" Elias answered, "Then we accept responsibility together." Alor looked at him carefully. "That sounds noble." "It is difficult," Elias corrected. "There is a difference." That answer stayed with Alor. Because he had always viewed cooperation as weakness. He had never considered that cooperation could be a heavier burden than command.
A commander could make a decision alone and blame others afterward. A community that chose together had to face the consequences together. The conflict between Elias and Allar became one of the most debated events in modern history. There was no war. No battlefield. No dramatic confrontation. Instead, there were years of arguments, public discussions, and difficult experiments. Some regions adopted Allar's methods and saw short-term improvements. Others rejected them and struggled with slower progress. Over time, the differences became clear. Systems built entirely around control could move quickly, but they struggled when unexpected problems appeared. Systems built around cooperation moved slower, but they adapted better because more people participated in solving problems. The final turning point came during a massive communications failure that affected half the continent. For several days, regions lost access to important networks. Information stopped flowing. Some communities panicked. Others remained calm. Interestingly, the places that recovered fastest were not the ones with the strongest central leadership. They were the places where people had spent years building relationships and learning how to cooperate without waiting for instructions. When the crisis ended, Allar visited Elias. He looked older than before. "I was wrong about one thing," he admitted. Elias waited. "I thought people needed fewer choices because choices created mistakes." He looked across the repaired city. "But I was ignoring the other side. Choices also create solutions I could never imagine." Elias nodded. That was Cale's lesson. Allar smiled faintly. "Everyone keeps saying that. Because it keeps being true." Allar laughed quietly. "You know, that would have annoyed me years ago." Their conversation did not turn Allar into a completely different person. Real change rarely worked that way. He still valued efficiency. He still believed strong leadership mattered. But he no longer believed strength required silence from everyone else. He became one of the people who helped create a balance between decisive action and shared responsibility. Many years later, when historians studied the age of living memory, they noticed something interesting. Every major conflict of the era looked different on the surface. Environmental crises. Political disputes. Technological challenges. Cultural disagreements. Yet beneath them all was the same question humanity had faced since the days of Blackstone Keep. Who gets to decide what happens next? The answer had changed over time. Once, people believed the strongest person should decide. Then they believed the wisest person should decide. Eventually, they learned something harder. No single person could know everything. No single person could carry the future alone. The responsibility belonged to everyone. Near the end of his life, Elias returned to Valen and visited the oldest archive. There, among thousands of records from countless generations, he found the original writings about Caelver. He expected to feel distant from them. Instead, he found the words felt as relevant as ever. One passage especially caught his attention. "The purpose of strength is not to remove uncertainty. It is to help people face uncertainty together." Elias copied the sentence into his own journal. Years later, his students would find that journal and study his notes. They would learn about his victories and failures. They would learn that even great guardians made mistakes. They would learn that Elias once doubted himself, once became impatient, once believed his own understanding was greater than others. They would learn that growth did not mean becoming someone who never struggled. It meant becoming someone who continued learning. And that became the final evolution of the warrior tradition. The old world had searched for warriors who could not be defeated. The new world searched for guardians who could continue adapting. Because humanity finally understood what Caelver had discovered long ago. The greatest enemy was never another person. It was the belief that we had nothing left to learn. And as long as humanity remained willing to learn, no darkness, no empire, and no fear could ever completely control its future. The warrior who needed no magic remained not as a legend frozen in time, but as a reminder moving forward through every generation. A reminder that every person, in every age, carried the ability to choose what kind of world came next. The world continued beyond the age of living memory, and as centuries turned into eras, people began to wonder whether the teachings of Kael'thar had become so deeply woven into society that they no longer needed to be defended. It was a dangerous assumption, because history had always shown that values were never permanent possessions. They were living choices. They survived only when people practiced them. A generation could inherit wisdom and still lose it if it stopped questioning itself. This truth became clear during the era of silent storms, a period when the greatest challenges facing humanity came not from enemies but from uncertainty itself. Entire regions faced unpredictable changes in climate, resources, and migration. Communities that had once been separated by distance became connected in ways nobody had anticipated. A decision made by one city could affect villages thousands of miles away. The old question of power returned in a new form. If every person's choices affected everyone else, how much freedom should people have? The debate divided scholars, leaders, and citizens across the world. Some argued that humanity had learned enough from history to avoid repeating old mistakes. Others believed that new challenges required new levels of organization and coordination. Among those searching for answers was a young guardian named Narave, who had grown up hearing the story of Kael'thar from her grandmother. Unlike many children who imagined themselves holding a sword like the heroes of old, Nara was fascinated by the moments before battles. She wanted to understand why conflicts began, why people made certain choices, and why some individuals changed while others refused. Her teachers often told her she asked too many questions. She considered that a compliment. During her first years as a guardian, Nara discovered that the world was more complicated than any history book suggested. She was assigned to a region where two communities had spent generations competing over access to fertile land. Previous agreements had failed. Leaders had made promises and broken them. Young people grew up believing the neighboring community was their enemy because they had been taught that story since childhood. When Nara arrived, she expected anger. She expected arguments. Instead, she found